Hello, everyone, and welcome to the UDOS podcast. This is the podcast where we talk about things that you do not know enough about, and this is episode number 9. With me here today is Muiz,
Hello, everyone.
and we're going to talk today about Brazil. So, Brazil is a country that is pretty big. Everyone knows it's for the Amazon and wonderful rainforests. But more than that first impression that people have, Brazil is a country which struggles politically for the past few years, and as a byproduct, the economy and the social state of the country has gone through many changes. So what we're going to talk about today is about Bolsonaro. So this guy is the president of Brazil, and we're going to understand in a bit more detail the characteristics of this guy, the politics that he plays, and how he got into power and what is happening right now. So, first, before we talk about Bolsonaro in detail, we need to understand what's happening right now in Brazil. So, a couple of things happen a lot. The first is that corruption is just very common in Brazil, very similar to Malaysia. Second is that a lot of people on the ground, especially your poor individuals, are not catered to, your indigenous people are not catered to. So, a lot of people are being disenfranchised. Number three is that COVID is getting out of control. So we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail later, but basically you have a lot of cases, you don't have enough hospital resources to cater towards individuals, a lack of oxygen, things like that. Fourth is that even though all these circumstances are happening in Brazil right now, there's still a lot of people that campaign and support Bolsonaro, even though the country is in like the most shambolic state. So now that we understand what Brazil is going through right now, Moise is going to help us answer like the very important question of who is Bolsonaro. Moise?
Right. So, when talking about Brazil, it is facing like the many problems that many other countries in the world is facing also. That is, in terms of speaking politically, then there are always the instabilities that exist within democratic systems. And with the recent events of the pandemic, those things are, just catalyzed and brought to light. These are underlying issues that has primarily existed long term, but it's just now being clearly shown. So I'm guessing that Vishnu is going to explain how this all came to be in Brazil. So let's just go right into like who is Bolsonaro. So Jair Bolsonaro is like the current president of Brazil, democratically elected. But who is he specifically? He is a former army captain for Brazil. That means he has served for his country. At least that's what's portrayed on the paper, and it's most likely to be true also. But the problematic issues come with his personality mainly, or his um, democratic like place in politics. For example, like he's very famous for being an incredibly racist, being incredibly homophobic, being incredibly sexist. Like these are like items that he stands upon, especially as his identity as the president of Brazil currently. So currently being from 2018 when he won the election all the way until his next election, until the next election, which is 2022, if I'm not mistaken. And he was elected into presidency with 55% of the votes. So not an astoundingly large majority, but a majority nonetheless. So there are reasons why people do vote for him, primarily for the reasons before. But before we get into that, I just want to give like a clearer picture of what his actions or what his policies have potentially led to in terms of Brazil. So Vishnu already talked to you about the rainforest or the Amazon, like that's Brazil's jurisdiction. But the problem with his policies are the fact that long term we don't necessarily see the Amazon being a place anymore. It's like endangered right now, and politically, like situations are overcrowding the environmental aspects of this debate. Like talking about politics, then we also talk about Brazil's democracy and how like Bolsonaro is actually threatening the democracy that exists behind it, primarily because he also believes in totalitarian kind of views, mainly because he is a former army captain, and those are grounds that he can firmly stand upon. So like I guess we now get a clearer picture of what his views are and what his future outlook for his country could potentially be. Like Vishnu, maybe you can shed some light on like what is it that Bolsonaro has done primarily in recent times in catering to the pandemic, because I think those are the larger more visual aspects of what he's done and can get the people to have a clearer picture of what he is as a president,
Right.
Vishnu.
So, firstly, we're going to focus more on the pandemic, right? Because how a lot of leaders handle the pandemic has led to most of the instability that we see today, much like Malaysia, right? So, what Bolsonaro did initially was he totally dismissed the virus. He said the virus was a hoax. He even said some weird things like, if you took the vaccine, you'd become a crocodile. So, as a leader, he took the firm stance of being dismissive as much as possible, trying to downplay the virus and encourage economic activity to carry out as much as possible within the country. He also uh, had a situation where the country had a lot of oxygen shortages. And despite this oxygen shortage in many hospitals, Bolsonaro did not enforce any lockdowns. So, this is a leader that had premised his whole campaign and political stance on opening up his country to the markets so investors will still feel confident in investing in his country so that his country can do economically well. Bolsonaro put all his eggs in this basket, and we're going to talk later why it failed. But the second and other important thing that Bolsonaro did prior to COVID happening and becoming a crisis in Brazil was he acted as a populist figure. So, a populist figure is basically someone who enforces a lot of policies that the people want. So, we need to understand one thing straight. Brazil is a developing country. If you're a developing country, you have a large group of poor individuals or individuals under the poverty line. Because of this, what Bolsonaro aimed to do was to carry out a lot of welfare programs, something that's also very common in South America with other countries like Venezuela, for instance. So, what Bolsonaro did was when he carried out these welfare programs, he would give people like financial aid, giving them money to pay for their bills, emergency payments to like cut off their loans, and just to keep people out of poverty while he's getting into power. Or those are the things that he ran on as he got elected as the president. So, because he ran on policies that catered towards the big majority of poor individuals, this meant that his popularity increased as the elections came about. And these were the main policies that got Bolsonaro into power, that he ran on being a populist individual, supporting the needs of the poor, and running policies that help them get out of poverty. Now, getting them out of poverty is pretty short term in this instance, and later we're going to talk about how this is pretty much long term. So, with these things in mind, right, Moise, what actually
Mm-hmm.
has happened to Brazil right now?
What has happened to Brazil right now, as in the effects that Bolsonaro has and its effect towards status quo, or are you talking about the leading up to how Bolsonaro could have like changed the situation? I'm gonna
Let's
assume it's
say
the
the
latter.
leading up. Yeah, it is the
All
leading up.
right, yeah, that. So like I think so. There are a few things that I want the viewers to quote on Vishnu right now. The fact that he said that Bolsonaro is a populist political leader, the fact that he rides upon people's desires and what people want. So there are a few things that I think are pretty inconsistent with Bolsonaro's history, but I'll explain that later on what he actually did in terms of the campaign that he has to ride on the wave of the previous political party that was dominating Brazil at the time. So here's the story. Before Bolsonaro, that is before his election, before he was elected into office, the party was led by, or Brazil was led by a very progressive government. Progressive meaning they encourage a lot of policies that want to further economic development and advantages towards minorities, allowing for poorer people to actually get lifted out of poverty, right? So those are the wave that the previous party that was led by Dilma Yousaf in the previous party actually. So yeah. So what did Dilma Yousaf do is the fact that she tried to like hold on the World Cup and Olympics event to show that this is Brazil's potential to become greater. This is Brazil's opportunity to develop economically, such that this was largely successful, the party by Dilma Rousseff, to the extent that this happened during the age where the global where a large majority of people in the world like tried to portray the future development of Brazil as being incredibly positive. That's why you had the BRICS, for example, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, like potential future economic powerhouses. So there was some development for or some truth behind the party, but the problem occurred like later down the line in her presidency, in which there was incredibly corrupt states in which we know that the World Cup, the stadium was built using the poor people's money. Those are things that was catalyzed that actually happened during her time, and the people just don't like that anymore. And then people got up to arms, and then people say we don't want corruption, and that's where Bolsonaro like rode the wave of what the people wanted at the time. Because during the party of Dilma Rousseff, there was incredible mismanagement of cash and how the commodities booms, that is, for example, like the Olympics as well as the World Cup, those are incredibly short term and they didn't necessarily last long term as what was projected to be. So all of these mismanagements led to the popularity of that party being incredibly low, which allowed for Bolsonaro to take advantage of that situation and just do what Donald Trump did, leading up to his own political career. So maybe Vishnu, you can shed some light on how is it that Bolsonaro was able to ride this wave of inefficiencies of the previous party and get into power, or like these are the foundations that actually happened. Like maybe you can add on to more the specific details of what I've said before.
Right. So there are three things to take note here. The first is the Progressive Party. After the events like the World Cup and the Olympics, because money was spent more on those events and less money was given towards the people on the ground, the popularity of Rousseff's party significantly decreased. That's the first thing to note. The second thing to note is that because so much of the government's attention was placed on improving the country's international image to attract investors and to have future alliances like the BRICS, this also meant that the political party was extremely inefficient to catering to people's needs on the ground. So the two things that are very important here to note is that Rousseff's Workers' Party had been very inefficient in catering towards issues on the ground, and because of this, popularity significantly decreased. So going to the next elections, Rousseff's party was already at the losing end. The next thing that we need to know is that all of these issues were already exposed prior to the elections, right? These issues of not being able to cater towards the individuals who are poorest, and you had a lot of protests, or you had a lot of like pushback from the community on the ground. But here's the most important thing that we haven't mentioned yet, and this is called Operation Car Wash. Basically, there is a oil company that the Brazil government owns called Petrobras. And Petrobras was going to open a factory in some part of Brazil that was like previously not economically developed, and they're going to open this factory where they're going to have like tons of job opportunities. What you need to know that happened like in a very concise manner is that these companies had bribed Petrobras for the contracts, and in the end, Petrobras was never constructed. So what happened was thousands and thousands of people had migrated and like used up all their savings just to start a new life at Petrobras, hoping for new job opportunities to arise, only for the project to never be finished. And these companies had swindled so much money. And this issue was really, really important because it showed the connection of corruption between these companies as well as the political party of Rousseff's Workers' Party. Now, this had the biggest blow to Rousseff's Workers' Party, where a lot of figures in the political party had resigned. A lot of them had come under way more significant backlash, because what is most important to note is that even though they ran the Olympics, that there were still some financial resources that could give people job opportunities, that could give people the economic benefits that they really desired. So what you have right now is a political landscape where the winning party didn't just lose out of favor, but it had crumbled from all these scandals and their inability to cater towards their voter base. So with this Workers' Party suffering, how did Bolsonaro then take advantage of this, Moise?
Right. So I think what's most important to take away in understanding how Bolsonaro was able to be elected into office is the power of the people primarily, because the people was very included into the democratic process. People knew what the problems were with the current party, and they wanted to have something new. So with these as the people's desire, what Bolsonaro did was basically what we saw that Trump did in the U.S. elections. We call this Trumpism, I guess.
Mhm.
So what basically happened was Bolsonaro, he used social media to reach out to people to explain his views. Now, we see the problem with the previous party was the fact that there was incredible corruption. So the first thing that he said was, I'm going to crack down on corruption. That's his primary goal in his campaign. It wasn't as much as the policies that he wanted to bring, but rather that he needs to get the devil out of the seat of power within
Mhm.
Brazil. Now, this is going to sound incredibly familiar for Malaysians because this happened quite recently. And then there was another political fiasco that happened after that. But ultimately, this is what we saw happen in Malaysia, where you have Najib, and then Najib was ultimately outvoted by a coalition of party known as Pakatan Harapan with Mahathir, and then things just started going downhill from there. So this can generally be seen as what could potentially happen. But going back into history of what happened to Bolsonaro, so he used social media. He amplified his position into parliament by appealing to the larger masses of the population. This is why even if he didn't have the best numbers, or he didn't have the best views that are morally right, for example, he still had like 55% of the votes, right? So there are two things that he basically did. First was like utilize what people cherish, like family values in Brazil, getting people out of poverty, blaming the poverty on the previous party, showing that he can do better and restoring family values. And then the second was like utilizing religion as like his catalyst to garner more votes, for example. The fact that Brazil, that used to be the largest Catholic country, but right now in status quo, we saw that evangelicals are going up in population. So taking advantage of that, Bolsonaro says we don't support like very liberal ideas, for example. That's where
Mhm.
his sexism, that's where his homophobic rhetoric comes into play. So all of these things generally put the people up against themselves, telling people that there are enemies within us, that we need to get out of this. These are unifying measures that he did, which can largely be reflected in many other political situations in many other countries in the world. So with all of these, we the general population, that is like these 55% that voted for him, can be considered as indoctrinated people that believe that Bolsonaro is the savior that's going to bring that's going to basically make Brazil great again, like taking words from Trump at that instance. So that is like how Bolsonaro played his campaign. That is also how many other political parties in many other world that face the same problem as Brazil take to win elections. So I guess like what the viewers need to take away from this video is at least be able to identify the political like measures or the political instruments that politicians play, and how they really only see their own benefit, or at least that is what we've seen so far. So going back into the idea that Bolsonaro hasn't really been that successful long term political leader that Brazil needed, maybe Vishnu, you can shed some light on more about the COVID-19 pandemic and how, like, building his career from 2018 all the way until status quo and facing the many waves of the COVID pandemic, and how that ultimately led to like the downfall of the current party and people just raising up arms again and feeling that they need to be democratically included in the development of the country.
So in Brazil right now, with the presence of COVID and you have a rise in number of cases, your economy starts to suffer, right? Because people aren't able to be as efficient. People are less likely to buy your supplies because they are worried of going to the markets. So because of this general worry and unawareness that people have about COVID, the economy starts to suffer. So what happens now is that you have a very high unemployment rate that exists in Brazil. That's the first thing we need to know. Now, when this unemployment rate increases, Bolsonaro has promised his people that I am here for those who are unemployed, for those who are extremely poor. What's important to note right now is that the economic aid that he promised to deliver has dried up. Very little aid is going towards individuals on the ground, which means that your unemployed individuals will remain unemployed and can't put food on the table. So the next question is, why did Bolsonaro not commit to his policies? And the answer is simple, that Bolsonaro did all of this tactics and this propaganda only to get himself into power, right? Meaning to say that when he banked on the idea that I am a populist figure, those were policies he ran in order to gain popularity. He weaponized the vulnerability that a lot of people had after the previous government was in power, where a lot of them had suffered from corruption, and he weaponized those emotions to make himself as the new figurehead of the resistance to get into power. So, what Bolsonaro has done right now is that he has not given this economic aid because he doesn't have an incentive to do so because he already is in power. But what he's doing, rather on the contrary, is in order to appease, for example, like the farmers that exist in Brazil. What Bolsonaro is aiming to do is he's ramping up deforestation of the Amazon and he's significantly reducing the environment budget. So Bolsonaro is now premising his campaigns or his economic activities on activities like farming, for instance. Even then, there is like a bigger problem for the international community. That's a conversation for another day. But here's the most important thing that we should take away. The car wash incident of corruption that happened in Brazil, he promised to take down the corruption that existed, again, weaponizing the vulnerability of individuals on the ground. Ironically, Bolsonaro's children and his family basically have been caught up in corruption themselves. Two of Bolsonaro's sons are already being investigated for corruption, and Bolsonaro is also facing the threat of impeachment. The guy is literally like Trump, and he's doing everything within his power to save himself and save his families. What makes things further ironic is that Bolsonaro himself is dealing with the companies that were involved in car wash in order to carry out corruption and to swindle as much money as possible to protect himself. So, if anything, what we can see right now is that Bolsonaro has preyed on the people's vulnerabilities, their weaknesses, and the inability for anyone else to step up. And how he has done that is to run on this populist slash authoritarian narrative in order to get into power. And once he's gotten into power, nothing's changed. If anything, things have gotten worse because he's running the same policies that are extremely problematic, but he's doing this in a time where you have a pandemic ongoing. And when this pandemic is ongoing, your economic crisis becomes much greater. So what we're seeing right now is a lot more individuals on the ground suffering from the economic impacts and the social impacts, as well as the political impacts of Bolsonaro's campaigns. So now we understand that Brazil is in a pretty messed up situation. Movies, what are the options that people have on the ground, or maybe like the government or other political parties have, in order to keep Bolsonaro in check?
Right, right. So we've had this long discussion just now regarding like populism and why populism is so problematic and taking advantage of the people's desires. Like, does this mean that there is an inherent flaw in democracy, right? Because that's what the general view that is coming to right now. But like you said, there are check and balance systems that can allow for democracy to flourish. Because right now, the problem is not the fact that populism is wrong, but rather the fact that the way in which populism is taken advantage of, the fact that people are put up against themselves, the fact that political leaders give manifesto that they're never going to do, for example. So to ensure that these two problems of, populism, like being toxic and not being truthful, there are check and balance in which in Brazil specifically and also in US is the fact that you have the Congress as well as the Supreme Court. So like these are people that have greater power than Bolsonaro in the majority to ensure that Bolsonaro is supposed to be doing what he's supposed to do. So Congress being the people that are right now in like that have the responsibility to ensure that Brazil is functioning again, they are blocking extreme proposals by Bolsonaro to limit democracy, for example. The fact that Bolsonaro right now seeing that democracy is a threat to his rule as the president, he's trying to push for more totalitarian and more militaristic action, right? So these are all extreme proposals that Congress and Supreme Court needs to ensure that they need to take extreme measures as well to ensure that they don't get passed, because ultimately that is going to be what crumbles down um, the democracy in Brazil, and allowing for the more people, the larger majority of people that are currently poor in Brazil, to face extremely hardships going long term into the future. So, an example that Congress and the Supreme Court is currently doing is investigations into his current handling of COVID, for example, the fact that was he intentionally trying to screw up Brazil, or was he like prioritizing himself over the larger demographic? So, because these investigations are currently undergoing, people, the larger majority of people, also believe that they have a larger responsibility to ensure that they must keep Bolsonaro in check, because the power to select another leader, for example, is within their hands. So, right now, what the people can see and what the people believe is the fact that Bolsonaro is incredibly incompetent. So, people are up in arms calling for his impeachment, going onto the streets, protesting. These are symbols of democracy that Bolsonaro really doesn't like, and that's why he pushes for militaristic action that I told you before. So, because of these check and balance systems that are putting Bolsonaro up against Congress as well as democracy, what can be seen here is the fact that it can be potentially beneficial, in which the more that Bolsonaro tries to oppose democracy, the more that democracy also tries to oppose him.
Hmm.
And generally in the future, that Bolsonaro will become the person that is isolated, and his powers is getting chipped away like little by little as time goes on. So there's nothing much we can do right now except for hoping that Bolsonaro can get impeached. But let's talk about the future outlooks of what could happen, right? Because I'm sure these are things that many people want to draw a line to.
Yeah.
Because there is the upcoming election in 2022, which is almost there. We are only a few like months away from 2022. Like, wow, surprise there. But the popular political figure that is running for election again is Luis Inacio Lula da Silva, or Lula for short. So, who is this Lula figure? So, Lula is a previous president of Brazil. He is in his term in office before, he is largely seen as incredibly successful. And then he was re-elected. So he had two terms. So he was, like in the US, you have one term, and then winning the election again, you get the second term, and then you can't become the
Go
president
again.
anymore.
Yeah.
But in this instance, then he was voted out, primarily because people just got fed up with him. But right now, he's coming back and saying that I can make Brazil good again. I can make Brazil greater again. I can keep Bolsonaro in check. If you vote me in, then I can be the hero for Brazil at that instance. Now, what I want the people watching this video to take away is how incredibly similar this is to what Malaysia has faced before, and how Brazil is also facing a crisis much like Malaysia is facing right now. Because in Malaysia, we had Mahathir. Mahathir had a previously successful term. He rides on that instance that he has capability. He rides on the idea that he can make Malaysia great again. So this is generally what he's doing, because the age is like, although maybe not similar to Mahathir, but he is like, if I'm not mistaken, 70 something years old. He could be 75 years old. Correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, running for election again, like these are all inconsistencies that exist within Brazil's potential political outlook for the upcoming future. So if Brazil was to take a look into Malaysian history and what Malaysia has done, maybe there can be some things that they can do better. Maybe the people that are inclusive of democratic the systems can be more inclusive, like try for getting new people to go run into parliament, maybe for example. But the most important takeaway here is the fact that the people need to be incredibly participative of the democratic system, because that is the only way that democracy can work. Now, I'm not taking shots at the current government right now. Please, Vishnu, don't call me out on this. But
Yeah.
right now, the problem with Malaysia, at least, is the fact that people like us, primarily students, that is going to be voters in a few years, because mostly we are in that capability, we are in that zone. Like, we have a responsibility to also understand the democratic climate or the political climate that exists within Malaysia. Because right now, it is in shambles. We have no idea what's happening, and hopefully we can get that sorted out sooner or maybe not later, potentially soon. That's the greater option. But anything can happen. But ultimately, people need to be included in the democratic process for it to work. So I
Very
think that's
important thing,
how.
Moise.
Yeah,
So
sure, go ahead.
there's one more thing to note, which is that as much as Malaysia and Brazil do have similarities, there's a very big difference between the two countries, which is that
That's true.
Brazil has a history of being run by the military, where prior to democratic institutions existing in Brazil, prior to democratic institutions existing in Brazil, it was mostly run by the military junta with generals
Yes.
and your lieutenants all being in charge. So, because Bolsonaro was previously a military personnel and he held quite a high position in that regard, we need to understand that Brazil right now has remembered that history to some extent, and people are also aware of those circumstances and the history that the military carries with it. Yeah,
Right.
I just wanted to add that I felt was important.
Yeah, I think that was pretty clear. But ultimately, this video is getting a bit long. Maybe Vishnu, some
Yeah.
lasting words from you.
So there you have it. This is us talking about Brazil. If you like this video, please give it a like. If you didn't, click the like button twice. Please do subscribe, put any comments down below, follow all our socials. The link for this video that we use as a reference will be in the description. And thank you for watching. See you next time.